So now we want to focus on wireless LAN radio frequency principles. Now this is definitely where the fundamental aspect comes into this course. You may look at this and say, I thought we were talking about wireless networking. Why aren't we just focusing on access points? Why aren't we just focusing on whether or not we're going to have a controller, how we're going to configure it, how many access points do we need? All that stuff is coming. But you need to understand the basics of radio frequencies because it is going to determine how many access points you need, the types of antennas that you're going to use, where you need to physically place those access points. So you definitely have to understand the principles of radio signals before you can factor in your access points, their placements, how your clients are going to connect, because at the end of the day, it's a radio signal. Just kind of keep that in mind as we're talking about it. So circling back to our campus scenario here one more time. Remember, our goal is we're going to centralize a lot of our infrastructure here at the headquarters building. And really what we're going to do here is kind of like the first step in a site survey. Plug in an access point and see what happens. There are predictive utilities, there are predictive site surveys where you can just walk around and look at the blueprints and look at the materials of the building and the physical layout of it and get an idea of how the network is going to perform. But really the best way is to get out there in the field and see what happens. So take any access point. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest. It can be an old dusty one that you find in the corner of a server room. Plug it in and see what happens. See how far that signal goes. See if you're able to recognize other wireless networks within range of your network. This is a very cheap and effective way to perform a site survey. Have one single access point and kind of use it as your measuring stick going forward. Now, we've already established that more often than not, a single access point is in no way, shape, or form going to satisfy our requirements. But the idea here is we can take what we get from one and extrapolate it to other. So with a basic understanding of the different types of wireless topologies we have at our disposal, we need to start determining whether or not we have sufficient coverage based upon our initial idea. We already kind of look at it and say, well, we've got 10 buildings. At the very least, we're going to need 10 access points. But let's see what we get from one and determine if we need to bump that up. Probably not going to bump it down, but just in case that we need to. So we have to understand exactly how much coverage we get from one access point, the variety we plan on deploying. So definitely taking a look at all things radio frequency spectrum. The radio frequency spectrum encompasses both visible and invisible frequencies. They come in the key families of audio, radio, visible, and X-ray. Audio stuff we can obviously hear, sonic, ultrasonic, AM radio, that kind of gets into a new family of radio frequencies. Within the radio frequencies, AM, TV, FM, other types of digital broadcasts, microwaves. You can see in between TV frequencies and the microwave frequency, that's where our wireless networks are going to sit. Now, there are other types of wireless signals. So the key thing to remember is that all of these radio frequencies are wireless, but they are not all wireless network signals. I got asked that question a couple of times ago, and they said, well, I know that there have been infrared networks before, so is infrared wireless or not? All of these signals can be broadcasted without the physical presence of wires. So by definition, they all are wireless signals, but they're not wireless network signals. So just keep that in mind. You've got ultraviolet, and then of course, if you want to turn into the Incredible Hulk, we've got the gamma rays. So radio frequency signals are used by wireless networks. The lowest waves are going to be found in the sonic category. If you think about it, sound tends to travel further. You can be miles away and still hear an echo. That's because of the lower wavelength. A lower wavelength is kind of the equivalent of walking versus running. Most of us could walk for miles and miles and miles, but we may only able to be running for a mile or two. That's how you need to look at what we're using that term low wave versus high wave. Low frequency versus high frequency. Lower frequencies travel further. Higher frequencies are more powerful, but they don't travel as far. Now, the wireless network range is technically within the microwave segment, and the radio frequency is officially defined as how often a wave occurs within a given amount of time. Whether that's 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, whatever the case may be, that's how we define radio frequencies. So when you're looking at radio frequencies on the proper equipment, they do generate what resembles a wave, hence the name wavelength. But let's make sure we understand the key terms here about all things radio signals. So frequency is officially defined as how often the signal occurs. The standard measurement for frequency, and I'll just kind of use this over here, is going to be capital H hertz. Lower frequencies travel farther in the air than higher frequencies, but the higher frequencies tend to be more powerful. Now, when you're talking about the power of frequency, it could be the amount of data that it carries if you're talking about wireless networks. You could talk about how fast it heats up your food if you're talking about microwaves. It could be how powerful the gamma ray is, or the ultraviolet rays if you're near the equator or if you're at the North Pole. All of those things are based upon the frequency. Higher frequencies tend to be more powerful. So in wireless terminology, lower frequencies will cover a larger area, but at a slower speed. Walking, for example. Higher frequencies cover a smaller area, but with much faster speeds. Running, as an example. Now, the official measurement for a frequency is 1 cycle per second. 1 cycle per second is the equivalent of 1 hertz. Now, when you're looking at the wavelength, don't make the mistake of saying, oh, the wavelength is the upper part of the signal and it's something else for the lower part of the signal. No, the wavelength is simply the signal from the transmission sent to the receiving antenna. It is the distance from one point into the cycle to the exact same point in the next cycle. So in this area here, we've got a wavelength. If I take my measurement here, the next time that signal repeats, that's another wavelength. If I take my measurement here and another measurement here, that's another wavelength. As long as you pick 2 points in the cycle that are at the exact same point in time, that is officially the wavelength. Now, wavelengths can either be short or long. Shorter wavelengths, the shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency. Keep that in mind. And when we're talking about short, we're not talking about up and down. We are talking about left and right. A shorter wavelength, aka a higher frequency, versus a longer wavelength, aka a lower frequency. So kind of keep that in mind. Wireless networks are going to use waves that are about a few centimeters long if you are using the proper equipment to measure the wavelengths. Now, when you're talking about how high or low a signal is, that's where amplitude comes into play. So let's make sure that we recognize the difference here. Wavelength, be nice if I could spell, it's technically Monday. Wavelength is basically going to tell us how far that signal is going to travel. Amplitude is going to tell us how powerful that signal is going to be. I know I have chicken scratch, folks, but it is kind of tough to write on these tablets here. So the amplitude is going to be the vertical distance between two crests. Now, those crests can be above the Mendoza line, for lack of a better term, or below the Mendoza line, for lack of a better term. The different amplitudes can exist for the same wavelength or frequency. It officially represents the amount of energy that gets injected into the signal. The more energy, the higher the amplitude. Now, within the amplitude realm, there is a difference between active and passive amplification. In most cases, and this is somewhat confusing for folks when they really start looking at the wireless signals and how they get transmitted, passive amplitude is technically what our access point does. It's what the antennas do. Now, there is a certain amount of power that gets injected to the access point that allows it to produce a radio frequency signal. But the antenna technically does not improve or make that signal more powerful. All it does is direct it in a general location. Now, there are omnidirectional antennas, there are directional antennas, but just remember that the antennas, regardless of the type, technically are considered to be passive amplification. They don't put in any more power to the signal. That comes from the power source connected to the access point. The access point passes that signal into the antenna, and the antenna throws it out there. So, passive amplification. Active amplification would be the equivalent of capturing that signal, boosting it, and then sending it back out. So going back a second when we were talking about wireless repeaters, the original access point provides passive amplification. The repeater provides active amplification because it takes the signal and bumps it up one more time before it releases it out into the open. So just kind of showing you the difference between a high frequency and a low frequency signal. We're talking about the wavelength. Wavelengths ultimately tell us how far that signal goes out. Amplitude tells us how much power is in that single signal. Say that 10 times fast. Now, when we're looking at some key characteristics of radio signals, I like to use that analogy of running versus walking. If you're walking, you can probably walk for hours on end, miles at a time. However, if you're running, you're going to get there faster, but you're not going to be able to travel as far because eventually you'll tire out because you're working harder. Well, radio frequencies are kind of the same in that regard. They can only go out in any one particular direction for a certain distance until they eventually die out altogether. This is officially called free path loss, or sometimes you'll see the term free space path loss. They're ultimately talking about the same thing. So just as human beings begin to tire the longer they perform an activity, the further a signal travels out from its originating point, the weaker and weaker it becomes until it eventually dies off altogether. And I'm sure you guys are well aware of the fact that if you've got a favorite radio station in Phoenix or Dallas or Chicago or Los Angeles, if you're right in downtown Chicago, that signal is going to come through clear as day, crystal clear, no static whatsoever. But as you go further and further out, you start getting towards Wisconsin or St. Louis or whatever the case may be, that signal is going to get weaker and weaker and weaker until you no longer get that Chicago signal. You're now picking up the signal from the next town. The same thing happens with all radio signals. From their originating point, they're going to be strongest. As soon as they leave, they're going to get weaker and weaker and weaker until they die off completely. That is called free path loss or free space path loss. Now, there are two causes. There's two main reasons why the signal ultimately dies out. It's sent from the emitting device in various directions. The diagrams that you see in every wireless textbook, they're always misleading because we always have those waves and we're like, oh, that signal goes out this way or it goes out in all ways. No, really, when you look at it on the proper equipment, the signal kind of goes out like this. You see how it kind of goes out in all directions, but not really one versus the other too much? It's very similar to kind of like Play-Doh, where you press it in certain spots to make a bigger shape, those sorts of things. So one of the reasons that we experience free space path loss is that it's not a to B conversation like it is on a wired network. If I have one end of the cable plugged into one device and another plugged in, it's going to go down that communication pathway. With the wireless signal, it goes out in all directions. And going back to my running versus walking analogy, imagine that you're running down a football field. Obviously, the fastest way is to go straight down the field. Imagine a wireless signal that kind of goes in all sorts of different directions. It'll do a spin, it'll come back, and then it'll eventually make it to the end zone. That's something else that factors into free space path loss. The other thing that's a cause of free path loss is what we call, and I'm drawing a blank on the official term, we talk about it in a couple of days now. It'll come to me here. Regardless, I'll think of the name here in a second. The receiving equipment is not always the same as the transmitting equipment. In most cases, our access points are going to have more powerful transmissions than our client devices. It's called asymmetric power. That's the official name for it. So if we have two different devices with two different capabilities, that's ultimately going to determine when and where that free space path loss occurs. You could have two devices and one still has a signal and the other doesn't. That's because of those difference in power capabilities between the transmitting device and the receiving devices. Now, of course, our goal is to capture 100% of our transmissions. Unfortunately, that's a perfect number, and no network solution is perfect. Now, something else that you'll kind of factor in here. Now, let's kind of keep this in mind. Free, and this is the reason we have the two terms. Free path loss is really a way of saying that as that signal leaves the transmitting device, it's eventually going to die off. Now, sometimes it dies off just because it dies off. That is officially free space path loss, but sometimes the signal dies off because it's impacted in some way. One of the ways that a radio signal can be impacted is by absorption. Different elements, different materials, different resources have the ability to absorb parts of that transmission. Part of that energy gets absorbed from the wave that's being transmitted out. Now, the wave stops when 100% of that energy is taken. Different materials impact the signal differently. Different materials have different absorption rates than other types of materials. Now, just because part of the signal is absorbed doesn't mean it's 100% gone. Because if you think about it, wireless signals have the ability to penetrate different types of walls, different type of materials. Heck, they're passing through us on a daily basis. So just because a signal is absorbed doesn't mean it's 100% gone. So kind of keep that in mind. The signal that gets absorbed makes the resulting signal less powerful, but it doesn't impact frequency and it doesn't impact wavelength. When you are talking about absorption, absorption affects amplitude. Keep that in mind. Now, different obstacles contain different absorption levels. So you have to factor in things like walls, people, weather conditions, high humidity versus low humidity. That can all impact how much or how little of the signal gets absorbed. Now, of course, something else to throw in with free path loss, the further I move out from the original transmission, naturally the weaker and weaker it's going to get. So when we're taking a look at absorption here, sorry, we've got a slight delay here, there we go. We were talking about absorption. So once again, pay attention to what's impacted here with absorption. It's not frequency, it's not wavelength, it's amplitude. How much power of that signal gets absorbed. It's kind of like taking a punch. If you guys have taken a punch, you know, if you've taken a punch in your stomach, you try to absorb a little bit. Of course, you try to block it as much as you can, but you try and absorb it. It still hurts, but not as much as if you kind of stood there and tried to take it all in there. I've been punched a few times in my life, so I can relate there. Now, with our radio frequency characteristics, free path loss is one thing, absorption is another, but the signal can be impacted by other elements. So when we take a look at it, despite the characteristics of the signal, we don't live and work in a lab-controlled environment. So we do have to factor in things like its surroundings. Different materials have the ability to reflect the signal, cause multipath, diffract the signal, scatter the signal, or refract the signal. So let's break down each one of these here. Reflection is where part of the energy is reflected and or retransmitted in a different direction. Now, the amount of reflection depends on the obstacle. As a quick analogy, imagine having a reflection in a funhouse mirror versus the mirror in your bathroom. It's going to reflect you in a different light just because of the different materials. Same thing applies to the transmitted signal. See-through glass versus a mirror. There's going to be more or less reflection. There's going to be reflection regardless, but it's going to be a different amount. Now, with reflection, amplitude is not impacted, frequency is not impacted, wavelength is not impacted. It's all about the direction, where that signal ultimately travels, which direction it is heading, but it doesn't impact amplitude. Absorption impacts amplitude. Now with diffraction, actually let's talk about scattering first. With scattering, microparticles in the air deviate the wave in multiple directions. This occurs much more on shorter wavelengths than longer ones. Scattering can either block the signal entirely or weaken the signal. So in many ways, scattering is like a type of absorption because it impacts amplitude. Now, scattering differs from absorption in the fact that it's caused by microparticles. Dust, humidity, bubbles, fluctuations in density, the different cells in different organisms, the roughness of a surface can all cause scattering. Now, the key effects that we get from it, degraded wave strength and degraded quality when the signal is ultimately received. So a lot of times you'll see scattering caused by dust, humidity, trees, because there's leaves and twigs and branches and all those different things in the trees. Those typically cause scattering. So really you're focusing on them in an outdoor scenario, but dust, humidity, somebody blowing bubbles, all those things can cause scattering. Now, refraction is where the wave passes from one medium to another, causing the wave to change direction. I know it sounds a lot like reflection, but the key characteristic of refraction is that it really is caused by different densities and humidity. So having a picture of a building here is kind of misleading. Instead, focus on what's in the building, if you will. Wood, drywall, concrete, all sorts of different densities, different types of humidities, different air qualities. So drier air versus humid air is really the cause of refraction. Now, when we're taking a look at each one of these, remember that they are all capable of causing path loss. It's just dependent upon the material causing that. Now, diffraction sounds a lot like refraction, but diffraction is officially defined as the process by which a system of waves is spread out as a result of passing through a narrow aperture. That sounds like an extremely difficult definition, but the way that I like to remember diffraction versus refraction is refraction only causes one form of the signal to come out the other end. Diffraction can actually cause multiple instances of the signal to come out on the resulting end. So that's really the key characteristic. What comes out the other end as it passes through that material. Now over here we have multipath. And really the key thing to remember from this is not necessarily what's causing it. When the transmission goes out from our access point or a client device or whatever the case may be, that signal is going to take different paths to reach its intended target. That may result in multiple copies of that signal hitting the target device. When a signal takes multiple paths to reach its destination, that's called multipath. Multipath results in radio signals reaching the receiving antenna by two or more paths. The signal can be reflected, the signal can be diffracted, the signal can be refracted, it could be scattered, but you're ultimately going to have multiple copies of that signal reach its intended target. Now, multipath can be described as in phase or out of phase. An in-phase multipath signal is where the crests coincide with each other. So if you were looking at the equipment, let's say I transmitted a signal out like this and it was received like this, excuse me, that's considered in phase. However, out of phase is when up is down, down is up, left is right, and right is left. So let's say my original signal went out like this, but my received signal looked like this. Down is up is down is up, down is up. So here, 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 that signal is different from the original transmission. Now, in the early days of wireless networking, multipath was actually a negative thing. That's because the client device would receive multiple instances of that signal and say, well, which one do I use? Do I use this one? Do I use that one? Do I ignore this one? So it caused a lot of problems with earliest communication. In modern iterations of wireless networks, we can actually use multipath to our advantage. In many ways, it'll take those multiple instances of the signal, form one monster hybrid signal, and use that to transmit back